A final word we don't provide. A different purpose this story serves. A tragic fairy tale steeped in controversy, to this day prickling raw nerves.
The Russian Empire, ruled by the Romanov dynasty since 1613, was in turmoil, in revolution. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, his wife, Empress Alexandra, their 4 young daughters and their son and heir, Alexei, are all held captive under house arrest. They are political prisoners of the new government.
The Tsar's children were my father's first cousins, and they were all brought up. They spent a lot of time together in the palaces, and Pa used to play with them like, cousins do.
The reigning British monarch is George V. First cousin to the Tsar, he despairs at the plight of the imperial family and watches nervously from the United Kingdom as their ordeal unfolds. The king is eager to help his Russian relatives, but is torn between loyalty to his family and political necessity. His initial offer of assistance to the Tsar and his family is withdrawn on government advice. Finally, George V appears to publicly accept that the door to asylum for the Russian imperial family is closed. That is, of course, what history tells us. But July 1918, the Tsar and his family, along with their few remaining servants, are living in exile on the outer edge of the Russian Empire. Their makeshift prison is a former engineer's house in Yekaterinburg, Siberia. They are being closely guarded by the local Soviet, but their guards' only loyalty is to money. The Russian imperial family, once the richest and most powerful in the world, are now living in depressing and humiliating circumstances. Exercise and fresh air are limited. Their possessions are looted and taken from them. They are supplied a very basic diet, and their conditions are dirty and badly maintained. The young heir, Alexei, just 14 years old, struggles with hemophilia and grows increasingly frail. The Tsar's third daughter, Grand Duchess Maria, tries desperately to keep friendly relations with the increasingly hostile guards. Her well-meaning efforts are met with nothing but spite and disrespect. Each day brings fresh humiliation for the family, who are now even forced to go to the toilet observed by a guard. Their royal titles now meaningless, they endure cruelty and ridicule from their jailers. The Tsar, to them, is now simply Citizen Romanov. So what did King George do about this? From what we are led to believe, it appears he remained true to his country and heeded the stern government advice. Whilst his Russian family suffered, we are told, he stood back and allowed this intolerable and treacherous situation to continue. But did he?
George did what he could. Unfortunately, he was rebranding the royal family at that time to get them away from the German influence because people were getting edgy about it. It was the First World War. The Tsarina happened to be German.
So the newly anglicised House of Windsor's position on the rescue of their Russian-German cousins was resolute. Seemingly abandoned, the Tsar's family in captivity still clung to hope that they might be freed. But with each difficult day that passed, it became less and less likely. It was becoming obvious. With the Russian monarchy now in tatters, the new Bolshevik Russia did not want any representatives of the former regime to remain. This did not bode well for the survival of the imprisoned Romanov family. And then, suddenly, without warning, the light went out on a 300-year-old dynasty. Tsar Nicholas II his family and servants were not seen again after July 18, 1918. They vanished without a trace, leaving the royal families of Europe holding their breath for any news of them at all. But when the White Army finally investigate after taking Yekaterinburg in late July, there is nothing left for them to find. A mystery had begun. What followed the Romanovs' disappearance was a slew of deliberately confusing and conflicting reports as to their fate.
The family had been moved to a new location. The family had escaped. The family had been rescued.
But the most sinister and persistent rumor of all was that the whole family and their retinue had been taken downstairs to the cellar in the middle of the night of July 17th and massacred in cold blood. Death by Bolshevik firing squad.
Dear Larissa, I guess I'm writing because I have questions. Questions about my family that I've had most of my life. Questions that could tell me who you are. There are two truths here. The one that history knows and accepts. Then this other truth that is woven into the complex tapestry of my life. It's more than a strange sense that something is wrong. This is a deliberate attempt to conceal something from us all. A secret. A secret that began with your husband, my great-grandfather, Owen Tudor. When he died, I was 3. I remember him. I loved him. And now I long to sit with him and ask him all these questions I have. Unlock the mystery of you. He kept us out. And now I think he did that for a special reason. It seems that none of us really knew him, who he was and what he had been through. I will try, but I fear he took all of my answers to the grave. Was that to protect you, Larissa? His first wife. His first love. It seems he was so intent to keep this from us all, just so no one would ever know his secret. Your secret? To my very beloved Larissa Fedorovna, who are you? Love, Daisy.
Nicholas II had 4 daughters, the revered and beautiful Grand Duchesses of Russia. The 4 girls had once been destined for marriage into the many European royal families of the time. By July 1918, they ranged in age from 17 to 22. The eldest, nearing her 23rd birthday, was the serious, devout, and studious Olga. Tatiana was 21, a feminine yet strong, level-headed character who was accepted as the natural leader amongst her sisters. The next, named after the Tsar's own mother, was the beautiful Maria at 19. She was followed by the youngest of the sisters, who was strangely destined to become the most famous, Anastasia. She was 17. Their younger brother, Alexei, was the long-awaited heir, once destined to take over his father's mantle and become Tsar. Alexandra Feodorovna, the Empress, was the Tsar's wife, a former German princess and granddaughter of Queen Victoria. The Tsar's family were devoted to one another, their closeness now part of the legend.
While the poor old empress was churning out girls, my grandmother was churning out boys. She had 6 boys and a daughter. So they were all with ages of the Tsar's children. My father was born in 1897, which I believe was the same age as Tatiana.
Living in beautiful fairy tale palaces and growing up in such a privileged environment, the Tsar's young family could not have imagined the sad fate and tragedy that awaited them. Nicholas II's 23-year rule had been a disaster, riddled with political uprisings caused by bad judgment and catastrophic wars. The resulting 1917 revolution was a point of no return. Under the new Bolshevik regime, Russia was no longer safe for any Romanov or Russian noble family to reside. Those who were not murdered by the Bolsheviks during the revolution fled abroad to live out their days as refugees. Most never returned to their homeland again. Among those esteemed refugees was the Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna, mother of the Tsar. She and some of her children and grandchildren were successfully rescued from Russia in 1919 by King George V, when he was able to send a ship to the Crimea and transport them to safety. A rescue that says a great deal about King George V's sense of responsibility and strong family loyalty. A testament, perhaps, to the king's resolve not to abandon his relatives in peril.
George did, of course, rescue the ones in the Crimea. Oh, and I think there were other royal families involved, and if the Germans hadn't overrun that part of the Crimea, they wouldn't have got out then.
And here we challenge the history books. Had King George V, just a year earlier, acted against the wishes of his government and made a similar secret rescue attempt? This time trying to save his cousin, the Tsar, and his young family. Our research leads us to startling evidence that such an attempt did take place, but was not wholly successful. Due to the sensitive nature of the mission, the risk and political ramifications, it was never reported. Perhaps purposely omitted from history? Something a powerful king could do. But by utilizing help from British military intelligence, did the king manage to liberate at least one of the Tsar's children? Did he bring one of the Grand Duchesses to England in a covert rescue mission? If so, which of the Tsar's daughters escaped? Was it, as popular legend suggests, the youngest daughter, Grand Duchess Anastasia? Or could it have been her older sister, the spirited and reliable Maria? Or was it the confident, headstrong leader, Grand Duchess Tatiana?
Dear Larissa, I dreamt of you last night. You were standing next to my great-grandfather. Tall, statuesque, composed and serene. I tried to see you, but you covered your face. Every time I tried to get a closer look, you stepped away from me, into the shadows, until I couldn't see you at all. You had vanished altogether. I see my great-grandfather, this handsome young man, all alone. He weeps, and then I weep. I cry for him as he looks totally bereft, totally lost. And then I wake up. Was that how it was when you died? So young and so much to give. They say he collapsed with grief at your funeral. A soldier crying. My family and I never saw him like this. He was always so strong, so reserved and private. But you made him cry. He must have loved you so much. I am captivated by you, Larissa. What is your story? Speak to me. I am ready to listen. Love, Daisy.
In the years since this episode transpired, pretenders have taken the scene, who swear to be the Tsar's long-lost children, and for a rescued Grand Duchess, created a smokescreen.
On a cold night in February, a frightened and distressed woman was pulled from the freezing waters of the Landwehr Canal. She had attempted to take her own life by jumping from the Bendler Bridge. She was saved, but the police found no papers on her person, no identification at all. She would not speak and refused to tell them who she was. With very little to go on, she was soon to be taken to the Doldorf Asylum, Berlin, where she remained for 2 years. Her doctors deduced that she was not mad, but suffering from a complete breakdown, which caused her silence. When she did speak, it was in bad German with a foreign accent. Fräulein Unbekannt, or Miss Unknown, became one of the most famous royal claimants in history. It began when she told nurses in secret that she was in fact the daughter of the Tsar, Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna. A legend was about to be born. Her story talked of her rescue by a Red Guard from the massacre that killed her entire family. Her rescuer smuggled her away to live with his family in Romania, until she eventually escaped from him also and made her way to Berlin. Lost and in despair one night, she leapt into the Landwehr Canal and onto the pages of history. Plays, ballets, musicals, feature films, a Disney adaptation, scores of books and articles were written about the lady who became known to the world as Anna Anderson.
Anna Anderson was the most famous of the ones that pretended to be Anastasia. She definitely didn't look like a Romanov. She never added up.
She was the self-styled, tragic heroine, a martyr of the former Russian Empire, and the world's press lapped it up. But the Romanov family didn't. In 1928, the surviving members of the family made a joint statement denouncing her claim.
Our sense of duty compels us to state that as far as the woman in question is concerned, her story is pure invention. Our memory of the dear departed must not be doubted by allowing this fantastic tale to be spread about and gain substance.
My aunt Olga went to visit her when she was in a clinic and didn't believe it was her. She couldn't even speak Russian. That was the first language they learnt. I was told all along she wasn't Anastasia, and that's what I always believed.
Miss Anderson, however, seemed to have a great deal of luck and a band of devoted supporters on her side. A combination that miraculously kept her claim alive, even when disproved beyond all doubt. She was sensationally unmasked by a Berlin newspaper in March 1927 as an impoverished Polish factory worker named Franziska Skanskowska. Franziska, a girl from very humble beginnings, had fled from Poland to live in Berlin. She had suffered a great deal of trauma in her early life, including rumored incest, a savage attack from a soldier, a fiancé who died in the war, a miscarriage, and a terrible accident at the munitions factory where she dropped a grenade and killed a fellow worker. All of this tragedy had devastated her, and the repeated traumas had resulted in mental illness. It appears she shed her identity as the Polish peasant girl Franziska after February 1920, switching instead to the role of the Grand Duchess Anastasia, a role she made her own for the rest of her life. Forensic science caught up with her, however, and the real truth was revealed after her death. DNA evidence from her nephew finally conclusively proved that Anna Anderson was in fact Franziska after all. Franziska, like all other royal claimants, had played a dangerous game. As we have learned, any possible heir to the Russian throne was deemed a threat to the new USSR. All Romanov refugees in exile lived in fear that they too might be a target.
My grandmother was on Stalin's hit list until Stalin was no more. Stalin managed to assassinate 2 Grand Dukes out of Russia after the revolution.
Yet Anna Anderson lived her entire life on the world stage, including 2 long-running court battles to prove who she was, and no one from Russia stopped her. Did the Bolsheviks realize that she wasn't a Romanov family member?
Whenever there's a funeral of one of the Romanovs or whatever, there's always new people come out of the woodwork that telephone me, write to me, whatever, telling me that they are my cousins because they are the great-grandson of the Tsarevich, the great-granddaughter of one of the girls. My parents always took it with a pinch of salt. They never believed in Anna Anderson.
In Paris in 1925, another Romanov claimant wasn't so lucky. Michelle Onches professed to be Anastasia's older sister, Grand Duchess Tatiana Nikolaevna. This lady was said to be around the same age and very similar in looks to the beautiful Tatiana. To gain more attention, Mademoiselle Onches was ready to head to Denmark to try and obtain an audience with the Tsar's mother, the Dowager Empress Marie. Tragically, before she did so, she was brutally murdered in her home. Her killer was never found, and many details to do with the murder investigation were withheld. It was rumored the Bolsheviks had tracked her down and killed her. If that is true, what is the significance of the Michelle Onches murder? Why was the Anastasia claimant, Anna Anderson, allowed to continue her crusade for recognition across the world? Yet another young woman, claiming to be the Tsar's second daughter, Tatiana, had been tracked down and murdered. Did the Bolsheviks know that it was Tatiana who had in fact escaped the massacre at Yekaterinburg, and not Anastasia? Some say the answers to claims from any survivors of the imperial family lay in a lowly, unmarked grave in Siberia. We turn to a disturbing mass burial ground discovered in the Koptyaki forest outside Yekaterinburg in 1991. It was said to contain the remains of the last Tsar of Russia, his family, and his few remaining servants. However, one of the Grand Duchesses was notably absent from this grave. Forensic experts argued over which of the daughters was missing, with some saying Anastasia, some suggesting Tatiana, but most agreeing on Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna.
Dear Larissa, Granny says she never knew her father had a first wife until after he died. He never revealed your story to any of us. Why? Granny also says she never knew that for 3 years her father had lived in Kent with you in the 1920s. He'd never mentioned it. He had been stationed there in the army after being asked to leave the King's Own Hussars. It appears he hadn't asked permission to marry his Russian bride. You. Somewhat of a scandal in those days. My great-grandfather, the rebel. So you both landed in Lydd, in Kent. And this was your house. This is where you began your tragically short married life. Walking through this door, standing where you stood, I want so much to close my eyes and go back in time to be here when you were here. To know what words echoed around this house. To hear what you talked about. To see you both in love. I sense sadness here. I know you were very ill and it hurts me. It hurts me to know you were slowly dying whilst gazing from the window day to day. I saw your chair in the museum. I touched it. I tried to feel if there were a trace of you in the wood, a memory engraved into the very bones of it. I concentrated, and the first thought into my head was despair, isolation, a feeling you had been left behind. I felt so sorry for you. I wish I could have helped you, Larissa. Love, Daisy.
Few were lucky to glimpse her. 'Twas the hope of the amateur sleuth to find who the lady in Lydd was, and once and for all know the truth.
So who exactly was Larissa Feodorovna, Owen Tudor's enigmatic first wife? She was described by those who remembered her as being very tall, exceptionally beautiful, and polite. Her hair was said to be brown with an auburn tinge, friendly and courteous, yet private and reserved. A foreign lady, an enigma. She was known in Lydd as the Russian princess. She inspired many questions in the community, questions that are still being debated nearly a century later.
The first time I heard the reference to Larissa being a Russian princess was from Herbert Preble. He always referred to her as the Russian princess. Herbert knew everything local. He had a phenomenal memory, and when checked out, it was accurate.
Following her marriage on the 16th of August 1923, when she arrived in Lydd, Larissa Tudor was said to be in her mid-20s. Unusual in such a close community, the couple were remembered for not really making friends or involving themselves in local society at all. Each day, Owen struck out for the nearby army barracks. As a part of his training, he went on manoeuvres or tended horses at the local farm. His wife remained at home, gazing from a front window in quiet and contemplative solitude. In her early days in Lydd, when she could walk, she cheerfully went to church, accompanied by her husband, and was admired by all who saw her. One resident remembered that she always wore jewellery and was beautifully turned out. It was noted that, like most wealthy people at the time, Mr. and Mrs. Tudor enjoyed their own pew at the front of the congregation. He, the dashing young soldier, and she, looking the very model of well-to-do. A neighbour remembered them always laughing. They seemed very much in love.
I would have thought it would have been quite isolated for them. Going back such a long time ago, Lydd, for a young couple, I would imagine it would be quite restricted. Today, if you're travelling, we would need to have a car.
Owen Tudor did not speak about his wife, but it was generally known by his fellow soldiers that Mrs. Tudor was gravely ill. She had tuberculosis and her spine was crumbling.
Spinal caries is what we nowadays call spinal TB or Pott's disease. This is when the spinal column is invaded by the TB bacillus, causing collapse of the vertebrae, and in most severe cases, deformity, spinal curvature, and even paralysis. Antibiotics, which would cure TB, were not going to be available until after the Second World War, 20 years later.
In her last years in Lydd, residents remembered her spending a great deal of time outside in the fresh air. She sat in the garden all day, resting or reclining in a wooden bath chair.
Fresh air was felt to be good for people with TB, as it stimulated the circulation and perhaps helped one fight off the infection.
Living in a 3-story property and with difficulty moving around, she was known to even bathe in the back garden.
Herbert told me that this lady spent almost all day out of doors. He used to view Larissa in her garden through a knothole in the fence. He and local lads used to peep at the Russian lady on her daybed.
On warmer days, residents remembered Owen Tudor carrying her to the large green outside their house, where they would sit together, picnic and chat.
In the 1920s, there was no cure for TB. General supportive care, nutrition, fresh air was about all there was.
Despite Owen Tudor's modest salary, he was able to afford a private nurse for his ailing wife. Money didn't seem to be an issue for them. Sadly though, for some time, she must have known she was dying.
The main symptoms of TB are cough, weight loss, night sweats, fevers, and in the later stages, coughing up blood. In 1926, 74,000 people were notified as having TB, and in the same year, 30,000 people died.
For Owen Tudor, the effects of this terrible disease were destined to haunt him until the end of his days. Tuberculosis cruelly claimed his beautiful young wife. He was devastated and never spoke of her again. And there the tale could have ended, but the ill-fated Mr. and Mrs. Tudor left a confused and complicated legacy in their wake. If Owen Tudor was simply an army man on a middle-ranking army officer's pay, why the trappings of much greater wealth, especially in his wife? Why did he never tell his children he was formerly married to a Russian lady named Larissa? Was there anything in his private papers about his mysterious first wife? Larissa Tudor had left her husband a significant sum of money when she passed away, the equivalent of a year's salary for most of the population. Where had this sick lady acquired such a fortune? Author and historian Michael Ockleshaw went to Lydd in the 1980s and showed a local woman, Alice Clayphone, photos of lots of women from the 1920s era. Alice remembered Mrs. Tudor very well, as she lived next door to her. Among the photos that Michael showed Mrs. Clayphone, she immediately recognized Larissa Tudor, going out of her way to point her out. Yet the photograph he had shown her was one of the Tsar's daughters. On Larissa Tudor's wedding certificate, she gave father's name as Adolf. Yet on her death certificate, a Russian patronymic Feodorovna plainly indicates that her father's name was Fyodor. By tradition in Russia, second names always come from the father.
In Russia, you're called, and I'm not Princess Olga, I'm Olga Andreevna, and they know by the Andreevna bit that I am daughter of Andrew. Papa was Andrew Alexandrovich because his father was Alexander. But they use it not just for Romanovs, they use it for everybody.
An exception to this rule was the last Empress of Russia, Alexandra, who took the name Feodorovna by choice as she began her rule and joined the Russian Orthodox faith. This tradition was shared by the Empress's sister, Elizabeth. Her mother-in-law, the Dowager Empress, also took this name, Marie Feodorovna. What is the significance of Owen Tudor deliberately placing this specific name on his wife's gravestone? If her father's name was not Fyodor, why was this name chosen? On her death record, her name is written as Larissa T. Tudor. Larissa T. Tudor, not Larissa F. Tudor. F for Feodorovna, as her gravestone reads. So what did the T stand for on her death record? T for Tatiana? Was Owen Tudor going as far as he dared at the time to allude to his wife's real name? Was this grave a clue in itself? And is there much to be learned from the touching inscription? With Larissa knowing that her illness was terminal, did she and her husband plan the words used in the gravestone together? Owen Tudor used the phrase, "to my very beloved," to describe his wife on the gravestone. Maybe not an unusual choice at first glance, but is it a coincidence here that the meaning of the name Maria actually derives from the word beloved? Is it also relevant that Grand Duchess Maria was named after her grandmother, Maria Feodorovna? Owen Tudor reference his former regiment, the King's Own Hussars, when he was officially no longer a member? The grave creates even more questions. Who was Owen Tudor's wife? It's established she was foreign, yet Larissa Tudor was not in the United Kingdom as a listed immigrant. In fact, Larissa Tudor, or Larissa Howard, as she gave her maiden name to be, didn't exist. There are no records of her entering the UK at all, a near impossibility given the stringent immigration laws in the UK post-World War I. She wasn't born or baptized anywhere in the world, according to records. So, how did she get here? And where did she come from? By coincidence, when Larissa Tudor tragically passed away on the 18th of July 1926, it was exactly 8 years to the day that the Russian royal family was said to have met their end in the basement in Siberia. Was Larissa Fyodorovna Tudor, in fact, a daughter of the last Tsar of Russia? A Grand Duchess who avoided the awful fate of her family to be whisked away to the safety of England? Was she saved by her cousin, King George V? A story that still comes from local people in Lydd is that Mrs. Tudor received distinguished guests at her house. One neighbour recalled seeing a carriage draw up on the marshy road outside Ferndale, the modest house where the Tudors lived. Footmen were dispatched to ask the immediate neighbours to make themselves scarce, which they obediently did. But not before one recalls seeing a smart lady disembark the carriage. A lady who strongly resembled Queen Mary. Whilst researching this case in the 1990s, historian and author Stephen Ingman Greer uncovered some startling facts. In 1923-24, living just a couple of miles away in nearby Romney Marsh, was a very young but soon-to-be celebrated playwright and intelligence operative, Noel Coward. A well-known socialite, during his life, Coward was good friends with the Russian composer Sergei Rachmaninoff. Rachmaninoff was a favorite of the last Tsar of Russia, a frequent visitor to the royal palaces, and an intimate of the imperial family. Another mutual friend of Noel Coward and Sergei Rachmaninoff was British author Ian Fleming. Lifelong friends, as well as witnessing Fleming's marriage in Jamaica in 1952, Coward also sold a property to him down in Kent itself. In his eventful career, Fleming was once assistant to the Director of British Naval Intelligence before penning in 1957 his famed novel, which became a classic James Bond film, From Russia with Love. The story of From Russia with Love begins on June 10th, 1957. Grand Duchess Tatiana's birthday was June 10th. The story centers on the escape from Russia of the heroine Tatiana Romanov, supposedly a direct relative of the Tsar, on the Orient Express. She is referred to later in the story as that Russian princess. In the story, she meets the dashing spy James Bond, who aids her escape from the Soviets in Istanbul. They pose as a married couple and are married on August 16th, the same day Owen and Larissa Tudor married in 1923, and the same place Larissa Howard was supposed to have come from. In all, Stephen Ingman Greer discovered no fewer than 9 separate, exact coincidences linking the fictional Tatiana Romanov to the story of Owen and Larissa Tudor. Interestingly, Ian Fleming says himself in a note on the opening page of the book,
Not that it matters, but the background to this story is accurate. Will this ill-fated couple's veiled legacy of the borrowed time they spent be discovered many years later in the corner of a cemetery, Lydd, Kent.
In 1998, the grave of Larissa Fyodorovna Tudor had been untouched and unloved for years. It sat in the north corner of Lydd Cemetery in an unusually solitary position, facing away from the other graves in dignified yet faded splendour. To the local people of Lydd, it was a significant piece of local folklore. Young children told stories about the grave. It was cursed. They would dare one another to touch it, running away from it squealing, fearing some sinister entity would rise up and chase them. Older residents fondly recalled the tall, beautiful Russian lady who lived very privately with her dashing husband and died so tragically. Since Owen Tudor had died in 1987, and with no other relatives of the mysterious Larissa Tudor to step forward, no one had any claim to or responsibility for her final resting place. A once proud and fitting tribute, the grave had now started to fall into disrepair. Its expensive iron railings began to rust, the touching inscription becoming illegible. It grew more sad-looking and overgrown with weeds as the years passed. But someone still visited the grave. Someone who had an interest in Mrs. Tudor. The local mystery was, who was this person who regularly returned in secret to place fresh flowers on Larissa Tudor's grave? No one of the local people ever saw who this unknown person was, yet beautiful bouquets would arrive to brighten up this lonely, abandoned grave of a long-dead lady whom no one really knew anything about. Some Lydd residents had caught a glimpse from time to time of an expensive car that would turn up, leave flowers, and then disappear. No one knew who this was. One day, the residents noticed that the once impressive iron railings with their distinctive Tudor design had been removed. It caused quite a furore locally, as no permission appeared to have been granted. Later, a stonemason began working on the grave to restore it to its former glory. This heirloom of Lydd's history was being tampered with, and the local people who had protected it had questions. This costly refurbishment was a mystery. Why was someone doing this? Soon, the iron railings were returned, recast and good as new, and by the 18th of July 1998, the work was complete. Larissa Fyodorovna's grave, with no expense spared, looked fresh and new. She had died exactly 72 years before to the day. Interestingly, on the same day, at the St. Peter and Paul's Fortress in Russia, President Boris Yeltsin, the world press, the Prince of Wales, and the remaining members of the Romanov family gathered to attend the grand state funeral of what were claimed to be the last Tsar of Russia, his wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, and the bodies of 3 of their 5 children. Why was the royal family's funeral and the restoration of the grave of Larissa Fyodorovna happening at the same time? What relevance did Larissa Fyodorovna have to the Russian royal family?
Somebody once said to me, "Do you realise one of your relatives is buried in Lydd churchyard?"
On July the 1st, everything was ready and the plane took off. Success was not complete, and I find it too dangerous to give details. One child was literally thrown into the back of the plane in Yekaterinburg, badly injured, and brought to England where she still is.
This is an entry from the meticulously kept diary of Colonel Richard Meinitz-Hagen, CBE DSO, a senior operative in British military intelligence. He wrote this on the 18th of August 1918. The same year the imperial family were in captivity, Meinitz-Hagen was in charge of the intelligence operation in Russia and reported directly to the British monarch, whom he had regular audiences with. Richard Minus-Hagen was described by his own son as a direct and uncomplicated man who dealt in black and whites, not someone likely to make up a story. It's important to note that he never spoke of his involvement in the rescue of the Tsar's daughter, but the tale was discovered instead many years later, buried in his private, unpublished diaries in Oxford. It's said the daughter of the Tsar, injured from the impact of being thrown into a plane, was quickly flown from Yekaterinburg to Vladivostok, thence to Japan and on to Canada.
Larissa's spinal TB would have started out as a simple backache. This might have been attributed to a fall or a heavy landing in an aeroplane.
She would have also passed through the Royal Navy's China station. During the First World War, the station was commanded by a close friend of King George V. His name was Admiral Sir Frederick Tudor, Owen Tudor's uncle.
TB's no respecter of class or rank, but it is commoner among people who've been in crowded, unhygienic, insanitary conditions with poor nutrition. Anybody that's lived in a war zone is said to have a 1 in 9 chance of developing TB later.
Conditions very similar to those experienced in Ipatiev House, Yekaterinburg, 1918, where the Tsar's daughters were in captivity. Unwell and injured, it's said that during her passage to England, a rescued Grand Duchess was passed into the care of one of her relatives, Arthur, Duke of Connaught, with Minus-Hagen remaining involved in the operation. The Colonel's own wife, Amarelle, later sailed from Canada to the UK in early August 1918, accompanied by a War Office matron and a mysterious young lady of 22, Marguerite Lindsay. Amarelle Minus-Hagen and Marguerite Lindsay had adjoining cabins on board the ship, Corsican. Yet when they arrived at the UK on August 8th, Marguerite Lindsay promptly disappeared. Like Larissa, she wasn't registered as an immigrant, and no trace of her has ever been found. So where would a wounded Grand Duchess go into hiding next? Published in a Woman's Realm magazine in 1970, a former servant of the royal estate of Balmoral recalled the most memorable guest in a long service was a rescued Russian Grand Duchess whom she tended to. In 1918, Grand Duchess George of Russia, then in exile, had established several war hospitals in the spa town of Harrogate in Yorkshire. She was a close relative of the Tsar's children. The Russian lady, Larissa Tudor, told her neighbour Alice Clayfon in Lydd that her happiest times in the UK were spent in Yorkshire. The Harrogate Herald published a photo on September 4th, 1918, of Grand Duchess George and several other local dignitaries. Everyone in the photograph is named, apart from a tall, slim woman peering out from the group, said to bear a striking resemblance to a daughter of the Tsar. Colonel Richard Minus-Hagen had a distinguished career in intelligence and was offered a knighthood in 1951, which he refused. However, in 1957, despite his earlier refusal, he was offered and accepted a CBE. One cannot help but conclude that this service to the Crown must have been of great significance. Service such as rescuing a daughter of the Russian imperial family? Did he keep this secret to the end of his life and beyond? Did Owen Tudor also? In 1941, this soldier, who had disgraced his uniform, rose to command his regiment in the field, hardly a reward for dishonour. After Larissa Tudor's death, and despite remarrying, Owen Tudor would return to her grave every June, year after year, until shortly before his own death in 1987. Grand Duchess Tatiana's birthday was June the 10th. Grand Duchess Maria's was June 14th. The heroine of Sir Ian Fleming's acclaimed novel and film, From Russia with Love, shared the name of the Tsar's second daughter, Tatiana Romanov. Her birthday, June 10th, was also used in the tale. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the famous royal claimant Anna Anderson still enjoys supporters who believe she was who she claimed to be for 64 years, the Grand Duchess Anastasia. In happier times and despite her rank, Grand Duchess Maria dreamed that one day she'd marry a soldier. Did she get her wish? The mass grave found in Siberia, said to contain the bodies of the Tsar and his family, was missing a daughter who most scientists agree was the Grand Duchess Maria. A recent second discovery of charred bone fragments have forensic scientists divided on who they actually belong to. These bones are a controversial part of the story. They remain officially unrecognized and unburied. If Larissa Tudor was a daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, the ramifications will reverberate through all known history of the past 100 years. Could this be one of the biggest royal cover-ups of all time?
Dear Larissa, when I was 11, Mama, Granny and I went to Lyd for the day. We reached a cemetery in the village and found ourselves standing in front of a mysterious old grave tucked away in the corner. I was told this was the grave of the Russian princess my great-grandfather was married to. I looked at the name. Larissa Fedorovna. To me, as a young girl, it sounded so exotic, so exciting. It felt like magic coursing through me. I was connected to all this. A real princess. Larissa. But was that your name? Truly? If your name was Anastasia, I feel that tragedy was your best friend. If your name was Tatiana, you lost your family, your home, your country, and then your life. So young to lose so much. If your name was Maria, I understand your secret now and why my great-grandfather protected you. I understand why you had to hide away and live your life under a veil. Is that who you are? A daughter of the Tsar? Tell me, I feel that I'm right. I stand here, an adult, and your grave still mesmerizes me. I feel closer to you here, and I want you to know I'm sorry you were left behind. I have seen your face now. You are beautiful. I will celebrate your life. To my very beloved Larissa Fedorovna. Love, Daisy.
You may discover a grave in Lyd with an aura compelling and strong. Who knows what draws you to it, and who knows to whom it belongs? Could this be the resting place of the last Tsar's daughter, whom tragedy never forgot? A beautiful rescued Grand Duchess, whom history tells us was shot.